Hi everyone, this is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and this is my astrological overview for the month of May 2020. So we're going to take a look at all of the biggest transits of the month ahead, as always, and you can be sure to check out my sun and rising sign horoscopes as well to take the monthly overview and personalize it a little bit more. In the meantime, I always like to tell people that what I do with these monthly overviews is narrow it down to those transits that I think are going to be the most dynamic and most significant. That does not mean I cover every last transit of the month. So I sort of have a process, a selection process, and I discriminate a little bit. Um, now, the beginning of the month is where we'll start, and we're going to start by taking a look at something that I have recently dedicated actually a number of videos to. So I'm also going to issue this little qualifier, which is that if you're interested in this first part, which is about Venus's square to Neptune and eventually Venus turning retrograde this month, that I recently did a 4-part series on Venus retrograde, which included a deep treatment of Venus square Neptune. Go back and listen to that, because this is the absolute featured transit of the month, and I've already done 4 full videos on it. So I'm not going to say as much about it, but I'm going to offer some highlights. At any rate, oops, I just noticed that we're set to April 24th. Let's get this to May 1st. Okay, here we go. So on May 1st, you can see that here's Venus at about 19 degrees of Gemini. Here's Neptune at about 20 degrees of Pisces. And the two are going through a square to one another between about the 1st and the 5th of the month. Give it a little bit of a wider range there. During those first 5 days of May, here you can see Venus just traveling through the square. Venus is slowing down, rapidly slowing down, which means that Venus is about to turn retrograde. Now, that Venus retrograde doesn't happen until about the 13th and the 14th of the month, but that means that Venus is retrograde, which happens at about 21 degrees of Pisces, and then Venus is retrograde backward later in the month, puts Venus into square with Neptune the whole month long. So what I'm about to say is applicable really for the entire month, and in many ways, the theme of the month, which is why I also recommend going back and listening to those 4 videos I made on Venus's retrograde. First of all, Venus square to Neptune brings up the thirst for an almost otherworldly level of happiness, bliss, and beauty. Venus is the goddess of love. She represents friendship, women, romance, as well as the arts. Connected to otherworldly Neptune, there can be a much more imaginative, romantic, almost intoxicating aura around Venus. This may also be very philosophical, very communicative, because Venus is in a Mercury-ruled sign. Can also have something to do with technology and media. And we have to also think about Venus and Neptune, unfortunately, also in the shadow side, on the shadow side, which is going to be about deception, illusion, fantasies, and sort of the potential for Venus to long for something that's impossible, and therefore potentially get a little escapist, naive, idealist, deluded about things as well. So that energy is very strong at the beginning of the month, really all the month through, but you'll feel it coming on really strongly the first 5-6 days of the month in particular. Now, on May 4th, this seems like a contradiction, because on May 4th, while that kind of otherworldly fog or haze of Venus-Neptune, which can be quite erotic and also sort of enchanting, as while that's happening, you have Mercury cazimi with the sun in Taurus. And that has more, especially because it's still just only 7 degrees off from Uranus in Taurus, that has this kind of dazzling moment of, it has the look and feel of a dazzling moment of clarity. So I recently had a friend of mine go like, what gives? Why would there be this symbol of like fog, haze, romantic intoxication, etc., and then this like blaring, trumpet of clarity coming through with Mercury cazimi? And I said, well, haven't you ever had that moment where you're in the midst of being like hypnotized or seduced by something? It could be a TV program, it could be something that catches your attention, and suddenly you're lost in a cloud, and then all of a sudden, boom, you have this moment of clarity, and you go, what have I been doing? Where have I been? So this could be a moment, a startling moment of awakening or revelation that snaps us out of some kind of fog or haze. On the other hand, how many times have you ever gotten deluded by a bright idea, right? Oh, I've got the greatest idea in the world. That's it, right? And then whew, it's like the fog comes rolling in, and then before you know it, we're out on some escapade. So the clarity and illumination of the Mercury cazimi moment, Mercury at the heart of the sun, Mercury conjoining the sun in close proximity to Uranus, the planet of awakening, could mean awakening from a dream, or it could also mean the kind of visionary impulse that's fueled by a romantic, vision or fantasy of something. And that could be a good thing, maybe not a good thing. So I would watch, though, for a blend of almost inspiration, revelation, and epiphany at this time. So interesting combination of Mercury cazimi on the 4th. Go forward a little bit, and we get to a full moon in Scorpio on the 7th. And this one's really interesting because here's the full moon, right, in Scorpio, and it's got almost an exact opposition as well to Mercury. And it's also closing in on, there's still kind of a little energy from Mars getting in on it. Now, that's not the exact full moon. It would be at about 17, but I'm just back it up so you can actually see it. Let's see here. Here we go. So here's what it actually looks like. So you've got the full moon at about 17, and then you can see the opposition to the sun. You can see a little bit of the square to Mars coming into effect. So this is, and remember, this is a moon that's in its fall in Scorpio that's ruled by Mars. So this is one of those more intense dynamics with the full moon. This was the full moon that the Buddha was said to have been born under, which if you kind of think a little bit about the Taurus Scorpio axis from an archetypal perspective, you're thinking about the difference between the pleasing, the pleasant, and the enjoyable, the sensual, the earthly paradise of Taurus. And then you're thinking about autumn and death, and you're thinking about impermanence and destruction on the other hand. And it was the Buddha facing the temptation of the demons under the Bodhi tree, and as the story goes, and touching his finger to the earth when he was challenged if he had a witness to his enlightenment, and as this particular story goes, and touches the finger to the earth and says, "Earth is my witness." And there's a lot of stories about that. And I think one of the things it's always struck me is what a perfect reflection that is of the full moon in Scorpio that he was said to be born under, the Taurus Scorpio axis, if we translate it into the tropical zodiac. So the full moon will test us in some way in May, with themes of decay, death, impermanence, intensity, confrontation, especially with emotional and more emotionally charged themes, while also asking us to live in a world that's peaceful and grounded and simple and enjoyable. So, how do we hold our ground in the midst of turmoil and make sure we're not collapsing into some superficial version of peace or groundedness, which Taurus is sometimes prone to do, but also in making sure we're not tipping into the opposite extreme with Scorpio of being more bent on intensity, drama, change, the elements of Scorpio that can upset or uproot peace and simplicity. So we don't want to go to either extreme. So that's what's coming in around the full moon, with a real dose of Mars, really strong. Now, between the 9th and the 11th, we also have Mercury square to Mars. So let me highlight that for you. We're getting into the square about within 3 degrees between the 9th. And then if we trace it out just a bit more, see, but by the 11th, it's crossed over. So see, there it is, 26 on the 10th, 29th on the 11th. And so crosses over a couple of degrees between the 9th and the 11th to square Mars. Now, Mercury square Mars is very incisive. It's very intelligent. It's investigative. It likes to research and discover things. It's critical. It represents careful and thoughtful analytical research. It represents the ability to be very specific, sharp, decisive, executive in our decision-making, thinking, writing, speaking. It can also represent problems with cars, accidents with cars, technology, snafus, or frustrating things, things that frustrate us. that might be technological in nature, like a broken computer or a faulty internet, or we get angry and we kick the door or something. So Mercury Mars can also represent violence of speech and bullying or intimidating or aggressive verbal or mental dynamics. That'll all be coming through from the 9th to the 11th. We'll be visiting that one. As you guys know, I typically do a video on each of these as we go through the month. Then between the 13th and 14th, here we go. So right between the 13th and the 14th, Venus is going to turn retrograde. And that's where you're going to notice this just really deep, significant changes are going to start to happen. And oftentimes you'll notice it right around that time. I would say anytime between the 10th and the 20th to give it a broad range, anytime between, say, the 10th and the 15th to give it a more narrow range, where you're going to notice a real shift or a turning point relative to wherever Venus retrograde lands in your chart. And if you listen to part 4 of my Venus retrograde series, I do a walkthrough of Venus through all of the houses, depending on what your rising sign is. So that might be helpful for you to look into more. Then between right around the 12th and the 13th, at about the same time, Mars is going to enter Pisces. Now, I love this transit because you're getting Mars out of Saturn's sign, where it's been in a kind of long, patient, lockdown Saturnine mode for a while, and you're putting Mars into a water sign. Mars has not been into a water sign for a while. You're going to get action and growth and movement coming back. We're in a pretty stagnant place, relatively speaking, for Mars at the moment as I make this video, and will be all the way up until about the middle of May. And when Mars finally gets out of Saturn's sign of Aquarius, with Saturn co-present in Aquarius, and gets into Jupiter's sign with a whole sign sextile to Jupiter and Capricorn, you're going to start to see much more dynamic and fluid movements. Water is fertile. Jupiter expands and grows things. Mars going into Pisces should start to return things to normal. For example, I would not be surprised at all if by about the middle of May, professional sports of one kind or another were back. And the reason for that is that Mars is ruled by Saturn right now, kind of locked down. Once it gets into Jupiter's sign of Pisces, it grows and expands. Now, it's going to grow and expand, let's say, with some qualification that may not be exactly easy, because Jupiter is in Capricorn, the sign of its fall. So, for example, you're putting this Jupiter back into Saturn's territory, and you're saying, okay, it's sports, but there's no live audience starting in mid-May. Or at mid-May, there's some resolution to return by June. Whatever. The point is that anything related to Mars should be loosened up, and in a more basic sense, that includes all of our activities or actions. So the activities or actions that we have ruled by Jupiter can start to expand more, be more fluid, fertile, and abundant. That's a good thing, and it's a good thing that Mars has some reception to Jupiter by virtue of a sextile. So yeah, Mars should pick up its effectiveness and kind of ability to act and grow things. And that feels to me like, right now, from the standpoint of being on quarantine for however long, that feels welcome. Anyway, then when we go, Mars entering Pisces is going to have some aspects a little bit later. For example, eventually you're going to see the sun come into a square with Mars, but it actually doesn't happen until early June. So Mars will have some action in Pisces that's relevant a little bit later in its transit. Anyway, so if we go forward from there, there's not a lot like past that in mid-month beyond Venus turning retrograde, which is a big deal, but Venus will then head back through the square to Neptune, which doesn't quite happen all the way up until like around May 20th, 21st, 22nd. Really interesting, right around that time, not only is Venus going back through the square to Neptune, which we started off talking about, I won't reiterate, but that square will come back, but then Mercury will be a part of it. So then we're adding in a Venus-Mercury-Neptune dynamic, the combination of all of the above. When you get Mercury in with Neptune, I have to say it's a little less comfortable than Venus, because the gist of it is that Mercury represents the rational mind, and Neptune is very mystifying. And when the rational mind gets mystified, sometimes it's a really good thing. Other times we make really irrational decisions, or it can represent mental and emotional health problems. It can represent disinformation. It can represent hiding and like secrets and lies and deception and gossip. It can represent spying. It can represent breakdown of communication and technology. I mean, we just had Mercury in Pisces for a good long time recently. So in a sense, we're reprising some of those themes right around the 20th through like the 23rd. At that point in time, the best outcome would be for there to be a combination of, intelligence, beauty, inspiration, romance, creativity, those kinds of energies together, sort of peaking could be really nice. People who write or make music, or speech becoming more fluid, intuitive, dreams speaking to us, learning something and getting an intuitive grasp on something very quickly. Those are all positive indications of Mercury, Venus, and Neptune. But, this is also the kind of thing where you can't tell the difference between a lie and a truth. You're being deceived. It's potentially a cloudy situation for Mercury during that time. Okay, so then the last thing is that there's also going to be a new moon in Gemini on May 22nd. And what this basically does is it takes the Mercury Venus Neptune dynamic plus the Venus retrograde, and it amplifies it by saying all of this shall tone the entire next lunar cycle, taking us well into June. So, really take a look at that whole sign house of Gemini in your birth chart, or whatever house Gemini lands in whatever form of house division you use, and think to yourself, this is where the action is right now. That should give you really the best information that you could get, just so that you're aware of what kinds of topics and themes are coming up. And then you also want to think to yourself about what kind of inspiration is coming to you right now, what kind of healing is coming through, especially in the context of relationships and communication dynamics in relationships, because those themes will continue to be a part of your inner process and inner work for the next month. So that is what I have for you. Those are the biggest transits of May. There's some here or there that I might mention in individual videos as the month goes on, but please let me know your thoughts. Tell me how this lands with you, how it resonates. And I look forward to connecting with you for each of these transits as the month continues. And be sure to check in on your sun and rising sign horoscopes. I'll be posting those as well. Finally, don't forget that my upcoming course, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, a one-year course in ancient Hellenistic astrology, begins in the middle of June. Early bird rate is in effect. You can save $500 off. There is need-based tuition for people who can't afford the course, especially if you're suffering due to the coronavirus. So please feel free to check that out as well. I hope to see some of you in class soon. Take it easy.